Neil Basu, QPM, recipient of the Queen's Police Medal, is a former Assistant Commissioner in the Met and former head of counter-terrorism policing for the UK. Also, I think the first guest that we've booked on this programme to discuss recent events on the streets of this country, and clearly a man supremely qualified to do so. Let's begin with some comments, if we may, Neil, from the Home Secretary yesterday that I haven't heard you respond to yet. The idea that the British public have lost respect for the police, that this current malaise extends beyond the explosions of violence or the expressions of unhappiness and runs much deeper. Is that something you recognise?
Yeah, well, good morning, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak. And yeah, there was a bit of a perfect storm. I mean, this arrived at a terrible time for policing, where since Robert Peel set up policing, modern policing in 1829, it's been founded on trust and confidence, which gives us the consent to police the public. You can't police 70 million people with 140,000 cops unless they consent to it. If you lose that consent, you're in desperate trouble. And of course, all of this probably 2 years ago, just on the cusp of my retirement, trust and confidence had reached an all-time low in policing as a profession. And not only had we lost the confidence of the Black and Asian community, which we hadn't had for many, many years, in my opinion, we'd lost the confidence of women and girls, LGBTQ+, and what we've probably seen over the last 2 weeks is a loss of confidence with certain elements of the white working class. And arguably, we've never had the confidence of youth either. If you add all of those different sectors of society together, you get the majority of the public, and that is a loss of consent in the policing model. So the two things, I don't think were connected, but nevertheless, it was the perfect storm, the worst time for something like this to happen to policing.
Well, I wonder whether there are very different routes, though, to the various constituencies you've just described, because the loss of confidence from women and girls in particular would trace back to Sarah Everard's murder and other notorious cases of police officers being the opposite of what we expect them to be. Ethnic minorities, whether through stop and search or historically disproportionate instances of death in custody and the natures of investigation or drug inquiries. These are arguably fact-based grievances. And yet when you have public figures saying that the police are possibly keeping information from the public, if elements of the public then get very angry and violent about something that's a lie, or at the very least a deliberately dangerous speculation, that's not a fact-based loss of confidence. So you probably can't, the remedy can't be the same for both diseases, can it?
No, and I think that's a brilliant analysis, by the way. But your original comment, where I lecture a lot on diversity, I was the highest ranking officer of colour when I retired, only the fourth to reach my rank since 1829. I know quite a lot about racism and inclusion and diversity practice and what it takes to be a leader in those kind of environments. And I talk about that a lot. But racism, I talk about because I know a lot about it. I'm in my 57th year. I'm a little bit older than you, James. But I've, since my first conscious memory, I've understood and dealt with racism since I was about 3 or 4 years old. But all of those different classes, the fact-based grievances that lead to, they're very different journeys. They're very different journeys, but they have very similar outcomes. The othering that happens in society. And what policing has done poorly for many years, and I'm one of policing's greatest critics because I love it. I absolutely love the profession. I think I've earned the right to criticize it. But it has, generally speaking, over-policed and under-protected those communities. Now, the difficulty, and your analysis was spot on, this was not a fact-based grievance. This was a lie that was made up. But if you don't have the confidence in the police, if you don't have the confidence in the state, if you don't have the confidence in society, which has been going downhill since the 1960s, you're going to get this kind of explosion of a response because there's no other outlet for it. And of course, when I say confidence in the police, what I want criminals, and basically that is what we have seen a great deal of, these are criminals, not protesters, not demonstrators, criminals. They don't have the confidence that they're going to get caught. People keep talking about deterrent sentences, but they don't have confidence that basically policing is any good. So they think, well, okay, I can take liberties because no one's going to catch me and no one's going to put me before the courts. And these people don't think of the consequences of their actions. They don't even think they're going to get sentenced. Sentences aren't the deterrent. Catching people quickly is the deterrent.
At what point do those criminals become terrorists, in your view?
There were two specific occasions, and I talked about this in the week that it happened. By the way, I haven't said the obvious thing is, and I feel complicit in this as well.
Why?
We all hijacked 13 families' bereavement and grief. And we should never have been in that position to be talking about this. We should have been talking about how we support those families and the community they came from. And you saw the greatest thing I saw in that first week was a community coming together to support, to say not in my name, and to support those families. And that was straight after a group of white thugs surrounded a mosque and tried to burn it down with, worshippers inside it who were clearly absolutely terrified. That crossed a legal definition for terrorism for me. The difficulty is you've got to prove what the ideology was. And if the ideology was anti-Muslim hatred, I want to make Muslims live in fear and I want to get rid of them and potentially I want to kill them, it crossed that line easily. And you saw something similar in Rotherham when it extended UK-wide, where they surrounded a hotel, which was an asylum seekers refuge, and tried to do exactly the same thing. And I was very grateful that the new Director of Public Prosecutions, a lot of people scoffed at what I was saying. And I was saying, there was a lot of stuff about two-tier policing. I'm sure you'd want to discuss that. You can't have a two-tier approach to terrorism. Try and think about the pressure that would have been put on policing and the government if a group of Muslims or a group of black men had surrounded a white church and tried to burn it down with worshippers inside. No one would have hesitated for a single second to call that terrorism. And I know that. I did counter-terrorism for 7 years.
What do you hear then when you hear the phrase two-tier policing? When did you first hear it in the context of it somehow favouring minorities as opposed to favouring the white majority? When did you first come across it? And what do you hear, A, when you hear it, and B, when you hear politicians like Priti Patel and Nigel Farage bandying it around?
Well, I think that's the politicisation of policing. We could do a whole show on that.
Yes.
Both political and media commentary on policing has done the public no favours. Great criminologist Rob Reiner said, you'll get the police you deserve. If you want to talk about them in that way, if you want to disparage them, if you want to accelerate the loss of confidence, and don't get me wrong, policing has the first responsibility to win trust and confidence, not the other way around. But nevertheless, if you want to amplify that, you're going to get people not wanting to join, wanting to leave. You're going to get them not wanting to do their job or exercise their powers. And by the way, that's exactly what you've got today.
Yeah.
So if you speak to any of my former Chief Constable colleagues or the Commissioner of the Met, you'll hear that is a refrain from policing today. So we can't have this catch-22 where politicians are using them as a political football to make a political point when actually this is a law and order issue on the streets of London. And any sitting government, their first responsibility is the safety of their citizens. I'm very proud that my final operational job in policing was defending this realm. That is the government's first important duty. People think of that in terms of war and the Ministry of Defence and our military services. Well, actually, it's everyday safety on the streets, which is actually entirely the responsibility of the police service. So if you want that safety on the streets, you should be backing your police, not using them to make political points. So the two-tier thing, I'm disgusted by. That is not what policing does. Policing knows that if it does adopt a two-tier policing approach, and it has done that in the past, and the not that distant past, then it loses trust and confidence from the section of the community that feels it is hard done by. And therefore, that's the section of community that rises up. And it's ironic for a mixed-race police officer to be hearing two-tier policing in regard of we're playing favourites with the Muslim community from the white working class community when we spent, the vast majority of the post-Windrush era over policing and under protecting minority communities. So there is a deep irony to it, but that was not the modern police service that I left. They know if they do that, they are going to bring pain on themselves. And we have politicians bringing pain on police officers who are putting their bodies on the line to keep the peace. And they are being put at risk because we are amplifying the idea that somehow they're playing favourites. They're not. That's not how public order commanders are trained. It's not what they do.
Speaking of amplification, and you'll be more cognizant than I am that some charges have been brought, but the role of social media and spreading ideas that are untrue while perhaps claiming that you're only asking questions or referring to the social media accounts of some, profoundly and provenly unsavoury people. The relationship between those interventions and the riots themselves. What if you were still in post? What approach would you be taking to the question of whether public figures have actually contributed to incitement?
I'd be calling it out. I'd probably be doing not much different than I did in the last week.
Mm.
In all fairness, my friend, the current commissioner, Mark Rowley, has been doing exactly that. So, also behind the scenes, I'd be asking our leading politicians to get together with their counterparts and try and get unity in the House about this is not the right thing to do. I did notice a quick flip within about 48 to 72 hours where even some of those figures who were using this to their own ends started to say, well, of course, I don't support violence.
Mm.
But there is a completely disingenuous tone and a shamefacedly lack of remorse that they might have contributed to the acceleration of this and the fact that it spread by making such, comments as, you know, are we being kept in the dark? Are we not really being told the reasons? That, and we use these anodyne expressions, misinformation and disinformation. I like to use the word lies. Just let's make it crystal clear. People like to lie to make a point, either to make a name for themselves or in order to get supporters and more followers. And I think that kind of thing is pretty disgraceful.
Finally, Neil, the former head of MI6 Russia desk, on precisely this point, Christopher Steele said that the security service will be looking very carefully at the instigators of these activities, including people like Tommy Robinson, even conceivably Nigel Farage, who incidentally said that we were being misinformed by the government about Southport. I sense you haven't got much of a bone to pick with that position.
Not at all. I mean, I obviously used to be read into a lot of that counterintelligence information. I'm no longer read into that, but common sense will tell you that when these things happen, and they happened with some of the terrorist attacks in the UK that I dealt with, we had the amplification by proxy groups and state-sponsored cyber, effectively warehouses of people and bots that were amplifying a message which would divide a society. My great friend Jeremy Fleming said when he was editing Radio 4 a couple of years ago before he retired, said the one thing this country has to be really clear about is that the biggest threat from our adversaries overseas is not nuclear weapons or switching off a nuclear power station or interfering with our infrastructure. It's the simple spread of lies which will divide society. He used the term disinformation. I'm using the term lies. That was the greatest threat that the head of GCHQ thought was facing us. And it is being proven. And if we don't do something with social media companies, which I tried to do when I was in my position, and the big six basically refused to meet me and my counterparts from the Five Eyes intelligence community, they agreed to meet the attorney generals. So when governments get involved, when the law becomes the law and is enforced against social media giants, and when their advertisers stop spending money with them, that's when they sit up and take notice. So you said, what else would I be doing? I'd be taking out responsible people with a big platform who shouldn't be saying the things they're saying. I'd be going after criminals who are inciting hatred online and prosecuting them. And I'd be getting the big six around the table and saying, we can either do this in partnership or we'll be legislating against you.
In that first group of people, we're talking about Nigel Farage.
I've made comments about Nigel Farage, but also two ex-Home Secretaries' comments, which are being
Priti,
done
Patel,
for
and Suella
political.
Braverman.
Yeah, they're being done for a political purpose. I mean,
So
if
would
anybody
you be
knows this is not
wanting
the right thing to do, it's two Home Secretaries.
Farage's social media activity in particular? Do you think that should be investigated?
I imagine that my former colleagues are doing precisely that. They'll be looking at anybody who might have incited this. So they'll be looking at the timeline from minute one, and you've seen actually some arrests and prosecutions in this space about who has amplified this rhetoric and whether the lines that they were using might have had an influence. But the law is very clear. It has to be designed to incite racial hatred. It has to be published in order to incite that hatred. I mean, people are very clever. We spent years chasing Anjem Choudhury. We've done the same thing with the Axley Lennon. These people are very, very clever. They know exactly where the line of the law is, and they stay south of that line. And it isn't for police officers, serving or ex, to start changing that line. It's for elected politicians and the society they serve to decide, is this what we want in our name? Is this what we want in our name? My view on that is absolutely not, because I have had to face the real world consequences of it. And I don't just mean as a police officer. Think of all those black and Asian police officers who were having stuff thrown at them, spat on, abused, potentially hurt and hospitalized, who, when they took their uniform off and went home for the evening, were an equal target. You've got to understand that lawful but awful, which is the great soundbite that people were using, which was taken out of the Online Safety Act, is a problem for society, and society needs to start debating where it wants to draw that line.
We're out of time, unfortunately. Can I tempt you onto my podcast where we'll have a bit more time to sit down and find out a little bit more about your life and background as well, Neil?
I'd be absolutely delighted. I think you can tell that I like to rant for the
Well,
UK.
it's a date. Seriously, thank you. And thank you for your time today. Neil Basu, QPM, the former Assistant Commissioner of the Met and the former Head of Counter-Terrorism Policing for the UK.